All right, I think we're recording. It's September 26th. This is week 4 for engineering ethics at NJIT. This is lesson 4. Lesson 4 is we're going to be covering Dennis Gioia and the conformity and obedience experiments in psychology. So a couple of things. I don't have the Prezi completely finished yet. Last week was a busy week. So that's not completely finished. In general, I really don't want to use this time to just lecture. My hope is that the lecture online is enough to introduce you to the material. And what I really want to use this time for is to talk about the material with the people that show up. So the Prezi's halfway through, and I'll go through what I have on the Prezi, and I'll mention the other things on the reading list. And then we can just talk about what's happening for this lesson. If anyone has any questions or comments at any time during the talk, go ahead and just interrupt me, because I'd rather hear what you say than hear what I say. Good. If there's no questions, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our Prezi. Here we go. Yeah. All right. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so lesson 4. This is our second week talking about the Pinto case, where our main readings for this week still pertain to the Pinto case. And next week, again, will also be a Pinto case week. So this week, we're going to listen to Dennis Gioia, who was the field recall coordinator at Ford. He was the person who was responsible for issuing a recall on the Pintos if they were deemed to be unsafe. And we will see today that him and his team made a unanimous decision to not issue a recall, deciding that it was safe, and we're going to figure out his reasons why. And the reasons why have to do with the corporate culture, and in particular what Gioia calls the scripts that he was following. Essentially, Gioia was following the rules that he was given. And so we're going to look at the ethics of just following rules or just following orders, the Nuremberg Defense. I mean, we're also going to look at some of the psychological dispositions that we have that incline us to this kind of behavior. So that's this week. Next week, we're again continuing with the Pinto cases, and we'll be talking about whistleblowing. So maybe someone should have said something before letting these Pintos out in the open, or maybe to get them to recall earlier. Maybe someone should have blown a whistle. And so we're going to look at a couple of people arguing over whistleblowing, particularly with respect to the case of the Pinto, to give us an entry into the discussion of whistleblowing generally, but on a case that we've looked at thoroughly. So this week and next week are also Pinto cases, but the goal here is not just to talk about the Pinto. Presumably by now we all know the facts of the Pinto. The goal is to talk about the ethics and give it sort of analysis. All right, so let's go ahead and get going. So the first major reading that we have is by Dennis Gioia. This is Dennis Gioia. Dennis Gioia currently works, here I'll show you, he currently works as the Robert and Judith Klein Professor of Management at Penn State in Pennsylvania. So he's a business professor, he's in a named chair, business professor, teaching business, among other things, he teaches business ethics. So Dennis Gioia, back in the 70s, he was the field recall coordinator at Ford. It was his job to issue the recalls. He worked at Ford from 72 to 77. The Pinto was designed in the early 70s and released in 71, and it went until 78. So he was there right during the peak of the Pinto, and it was his job to oversee the safety issues related to the Pinto. Actually, let me jump out of this and let's just go straight into his article. So he writes this article, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics. Notice this article was written in 1982, which is long after any of the Pinto case happens. So Dennis Gioia's personal career, you can see that he was working at Ford from 72 to 75 after getting his MBA. And then right after that, he went back into academia to get his doctorate in psychology, and then he went into business organization and business management. So he was in Ford for just a little bit and then went back to the teaching world. research world. And this story is going to be about Dennis Gioia, so we need to learn a little bit about Dennis Gioia. I want to read just a little bit from the beginning here. So he talks about his life going into this MBA program, where he calls himself a prototypical child of the 60s. He says his principles were high. He had the intentions of helping a troubled world. He was also active in Vietnam protests, he says, demonstrations, and so on. He was worried about the ethical failure in business, and he thought that he could do something to change it. So he went into the business world with principles and sort of high ideals, intending to change a troubled world, intending to help a troubled world. He wore his hair long. He was a child of the 60s. And because he was such sort of social and political radical, his friends were dumbstruck when he took a job at Ford. But he said he would have, a greater chance of influencing social business if he worked behind the scenes on the inside rather than as some strident voice on the outside. Besides, he liked cars. Right? So he thought that he would be able to do the best work and realize his ideals by working within the system. He thought he could change the system better from the inside than the outside. And instead what happened is that the culture overtakes him. Right? So the tournament-style socialization, it's very competitive, highly dynamic, very challenging. A lot of people gunning for the same jobs. This kind of competitive atmosphere sort of immersed him in this work. And some of the greater cultural and social issues made him start to identify more with Ford as a company and with his role in Ford than with the ideals that he came into the business world with. One second, sorry. So, sorry. Yeah, so he comes into business world with these highfalutin ideals, and it gets sucked away from him very quickly, in particular because of the pressure being put on the automotive industry in the early 70s. Remember, just a few years before this was the Unsafe at Any Speed, the Ralph Nader book, that was putting a lot of pressure for corporations for the auto companies to put safety standards on their cars, seatbelts and airbags and so on. And because there was a strong social pressure, regulatory pressure from government, there was this sort of us versus them attitude where we, the Ford members, needed to defend ourselves against them, all the outside parties and voices demanding that we change our ways. Right? So he had this us versus them mentality where he started to question whether he was identifying really with himself and his own values or with Ford and their values, their culture. He was the field recall coordinator. It was a position that wielded influence beyond its level, he says. He was in charge of operational campaigns of all the operational coordination of all the recall campaigns currently underway. He was also in charge of tracking information that was incoming to identify potential problems. He was in a position to make recommendations about future recalls, in particular about safety campaigns, campaigns where driver injury or customer death was possible. There's lots of these kinds of issues that were known about, and they had to make decisions about which to issue safety recalls for and which not. So he wants to set the corporate stage a little bit, and he starts talking about the backgrounds from the Pinto. This is stuff we covered last week, that it needed to be under 2,000 pounds and $2,000. Large corporate pressure to keep these requirements. And so the tooling was already well underway when the crash test revealed these problems. Now he wasn't involved, Gioia was not involved with the crash test, he was involved with the recall campaign. And so he didn't actually know about these crash tests until much later. Okay, so his experience at Ford, he took over the job in '73. There were lots of different problems, some affecting millions of cars. He wasn't actually allowed to say the word problem because it suggested a corporate admission of culpability. So instead of saying there was a problem with the cars, you have to say there was a condition with the cars. This kind of policing of language and careful language is part of how you set the terms of the corporate culture, set the terms of the script that everyone else ends up following. And we can see that in some of the resources come later. So you're not allowed to talk about problems, you're not allowed to talk about failures. But there were these conditions. Some of them led to accidents that might end up issuing recalls. So one of these files concerned the Pintos lighting up. He says there were actually very few reports because perhaps component failure was not initially assumed. He says, but was there a problem? Not as far as I was concerned. The cue for labeling a case of problem was either high frequencies of occurrence or directly traceable causes. Right? If it occurred a lot of times, or if there was a direct and traceable cause, then you issue a recall. But if it was rare or there wasn't a directly traceable cause, then it didn't fit the script for recalls. So he says, I had little time for speculative contemplation on potential problems that did not fit the pattern that suggested known courses of action leading to possible recall. He says, I remember feeling disquieted by a field report accompanied by graphic detailed photos of the remains of burned out Pintos in which several people had died. Although the report became part of my file, I didn't flag it as a special case. And then he talks about how hard it was to have this job. So because part of the point here is trying to sympathize and get into Gioia's head, I want to read this whole thing. So he says, it's difficult to convey the overwhelming complexity and pace of the job of keeping track of so many active or potential recall campaigns. It remains the busiest, most information-filled job I've ever had or would want to hold. Each case required a myriad of information gathering and execution stages. I distinctly remember that the information processing demands led me to confuse the facts from one problem case with another on several occasions because the telltale signs of recall candidate cases were so similar. I thought of myself as a fireman who perfectly fit the description of one of my colleagues. This is an office. In this office, everything is a crisis. You only have time to put out the big fires and spit on the little ones. By those standards, the Pinto problem was a distinctly little one. It's also important to convey the muting of emotion involved in the recall coordinator's job. I remember contemplating the fact that my job literally involved life or death matters. I was sometimes responsible for finding and fixing cars now because someone's life might depend on it. I took it very seriously early in the job. I sometimes woke up at night wondering whether I'd covered all the bases. Had I left some unknown person at risk because I hadn't thought of something? That soon faded, however, and of necessity, consideration of people's lives became fairly removed. Became a fairly removed, dispassionate process. To do the job well, there was little room for emotion. Allowing it to surface was potentially paralyzing and prevented rational decisions about which cases to recommend for recall. On moral grounds, I knew I could recommend most of the vehicles on my safety tracking list for recall and risk earning the label of bleeding heart. But on practical grounds, I recognized that people implicitly accept risk in their cars. We could not recall all cars with potential problems and stay in business. I learned to be responsive to those cars that suggested an imminent, dangerous problem. And then he talks about the oil crisis at the time and how that put pressure to build cars like Ford. Yeah. So let me go to the group and see if there's any questions. Questions, comments? Okay. Okay, I pulled up chat in case you want to leave a question in chat also. Okay, so I mean, this is this discussion here about how hard it was to do this job, how personally he took it, how much it disrupted his sleep. This is designed to make you feel a little bit sorry for Gioia. He's trying to make you sympathize with how difficult this job is. Now, maybe you're not persuaded. Maybe you think that, look, if this job requires so much information and such delicate decisions, and requires so much information that you're going to confuse all the cases and maybe not be able to make those decisions well. I mean, he was worried about emotion getting involved. It looks like just the amount of information he had to process was already more than he could handle. Maybe if this job is more than someone can handle, someone shouldn't have that job, or maybe several people should have that job, and it shouldn't all come down to one person, right? So, I mean, maybe the problem here is not just with Gioia's decision, but with the position that he has itself. Maybe that position is just too much for one person to handle. There's also this stuff about emotional distance, right? He had to stop thinking about individual life and matters, life and death. He had to stop thinking about individuals living and dying and sort of empathizing with them individually. He had to start thinking about how to do the job in a very general sense, in a very detached and removed sense. And he says that that was of necessity. So again, you might think that if the job requires that you ignore your emotions and stop considering other people's lives, then maybe that's not a very good job to have. Maybe that's not, right? So maybe the ethical problems here aren't just with Gioia's decision and the culture that brought him to make that decision, but maybe it's with the whole structure of the corporation that puts people in these positions in the first place. And this is what Gioia eventually wants to argue. So he wants to say that when he made these decisions, he was following the script. The script was for high frequencies of occurrence or directly traceable causes. Since those didn't obtain, it was a no-brainer to not issue a recall. Yeah, so let me go to the decision itself. So he says, as the reports trickled in, he eventually decided that maybe they needed to make a decision. So he recommended a preliminary department level review, got everyone together, discussed the criteria, justification for recall, and he says, and everyone voted against recommending recall, including me. It did not fit the pattern of recallable standards. The evidence was not overwhelming that the car was defective in some way, so the case was actually straightforward. It was a good business decision, even if people might be dying. And he says that they didn't know about the crash test data at the time, so they didn't know that this was possibly a common occurrence. He says, until the crash test data became known, it just didn't look like it was a big deal. In fact, comparisons revealed that although many cars in the subcompact class suffered from appalling deformation and relatively low-speed collisions, the Pinto was only the worst of a bad loss. Furthermore, the gap between the Pinto and the competition was not dramatic in terms of speed at which the fuel tank rupture was likely to occur. On that basis, it would be difficult to justify recall of cars that were comparable to others on the market. In the face of even more compelling evidence that people were probably going to die in this car, I again included myself in the group of decision makers who voted not to recommend recall to the highest levels of the organization. Right, so Dennis Gioia recognized that there might be a problem, called a meeting, reviewed the terms when you are supposed to do a recall, and decided that this didn't qualify. So on the basis of the corporate script, on the basis of the rules set down by the corporation you're working for, he should not have issued a recall. Okay, and then Mark Dowie in 1977 publishes his paper. It becomes a big scandal. The NHTSA, the Government Regulatory Commission, in 1978 eventually finds that the Pinto is defective. But remember, Ford isn't fined for criminal behavior. They go to trial for criminal behavior. This is the first time ever that a corporation has tried for criminal behavior, but they're found not guilty. They dodge the bullet. And then shortly thereafter, they cease production of the Pinto. Now they have some other subcompact car. Let me go back to the payout. Yeah, so a jury awarded one of the early burn victims $125 million, which is way more than the $200,000 that Ford was expecting to spend on deaths and burn victims, $125 million. But later a judge reduced that to $6 million in damages. So this is not part of the criminal trial, this is part of the civil trial, $6 million in damages. $6 million is still quite a bit more than the $200,000 that Ford expected to spend. But if only a dozen or 24 people died in this way, and assuming Ford paid $6 million to 24 people, that's still less than the gap between how much it would cost to do a recall and fix all the vehicles versus how much they would save by just paying people off. Right. So their original estimate was $200,000 per death. If it actually ended up costing $6 million per death, that's a lot more. It's an order of magnitude more. But if only 24 people died. Oops. Yeah, come on in.
Oh, I see.
Thank you.
You have garbage?
It's empty right now.
Okay, thank you. I know you're here?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Good. Thank you. yeah, so Ford paid more than they expected, but if not very many people died, you might think that they still ended up saving money by making this decision. Still looks like a good business decision if our standard is how much money do you make. Okay. Okay, so just to finish up, just wrap up the story about Gioia. Gioia, after all these court cases, he starts to worry, why didn't I see the gravity of this problem and its ethical overtones? What happened to the value system that I carried with me into Ford? Should I have acted differently, given what I knew then? This experience hasn't been pleasant. He says then when he starts teaching his MBA classes and teaching business ethics classes, he says it's sometimes a trying experience to get through these classes. Where they have to talk about all the facts of the case. And then after getting to know me for a semester, when his students find out that he did not vote to recommend recall, they're often incredulous. They even get angry at him for apparently for not having lived what he's been teaching. They call him a charlatan, and they otherwise vilify him. Right. So this is again, Dennis really wants you to feel bad for him. Feel bad for him about how hard the job was, how difficult the decision was, how good his intentions were, how good how his goals in college, his values in college, and then how hard the job was, how much it woke him up at night. And then even afterwards, he gets vilified by his students. All this stuff is Gioia trying to get you to feel bad about him, bad for him, feel sorry for him, so you don't hold him as responsible. Because that's Gioia's goal, right? He says his thesis in this paper is that this is his thesis. He says, my own schematized scripted knowledge influenced me to perceive recall issues in terms of the prevailing decision environment and to unconsciously overlook key features of this Pinto case, mainly because they did not fit into an existing script. Although the outcomes of the case carry retrospectively obvious ethical overtones, the schemas driving my perceptions and actions precluded considerations of the issues in ethical terms because the scripts did not include ethical dimensions. Right, so he didn't act ethically because the scripts that he was following didn't tell him to act ethically, and he was just following the scripts. So this is his argument. This is a very fancy way of saying he was just following orders. It's a very educated and technical way of saying I was just following orders. We might have talked about this a little bit before. This is called the Nuremberg Defense. Superior orders defense. Only following orders or just following an order. Right? Is the idea that a member, that somebody cannot be held guilty for the actions to which they were ordered to do by a superior officer. The idea is if your boss, if your commanding officer in the military tells you to do something, then you're not responsible for what happened because it was your superior officer who told you to do it. You were just following orders. Right. So, for instance, in the My Lai massacre in 1968 in Vietnam, My Lai massacre was a bunch of civilians that U.S. soldiers sort of dragged these people into the streets and killed them all, including men, women, and children. Some of the women were raped and mutilated. These were U.S. soldiers, and the U.S. soldiers were told to do this by their commanding officer. Caused global outrage. This is part of the reason why everyone turned against the Vietnam War. In this situation, the officer who gave the order is definitely responsible, but so are all of the soldiers who follow that order. In general, the general attitude towards superior orders to the Nuremberg Defense is that it's not enough to be considered. It's not enough to escape punishment. It might lessen the punishment. Maybe you're not as responsible as the superior officer who ordered you to do the thing, but you still bear responsibility. Let me say that again. When a commanding officer or a boss or anyone who's your superior tells you to do something, whatever you do, you're still responsible for that thing you do. Maybe not as responsible as your superior, but you can still be held responsible. So if it results in someone dying or someone getting hurt, even if you were just following orders, you can still bear responsibility. In the engineering case, a similar case in engineering is going to be the case of the engineer. So often on project, there's a licensed engineer who's overseeing a big project. And on that project, there's a bunch of maybe other engineers, but who are not holding the license for that project. And then maybe a bunch of other technicians who aren't licensed engineers at all. Maybe all of these people are following the lead of the head engineer, the lead engineer. And so the lead engineer bears a lot of responsibility for what happens during that project. And if something goes wrong because of a bad decision somewhere along the line, the head engineer might get their license revoked for whatever reason. But even though there's someone on top who bears maybe the lion's share of the responsibility, everyone below them following those orders can also be held accountable. It's not enough to escape punishment. In particular, if your commanding officer tells you to do something illegal, immoral, unethical, then you're responsible for taking that action. And you might be held accountable for any consequences that result. Just because someone tells you to do something unethical doesn't mean that you should do it. In other words, another way of saying this is that you have the right to ignore orders, to violate orders, to have a dissenting opinion, even when a superior tells you to do something. Right? So if it's your boss telling you to do something that you know is wrong, you have the moral and legal obligation to not do that thing. If your commanding officer in the military tells you to do something that you know to be wrong, like massacre a bunch of innocent civilians, you have the obligation, moral and legal obligation, to not do that thing, to resist the orders, to not do what your superiors say. So we're going to come back to the Nuremberg defense towards the end of this, but this is the kind of defense that Gioia is giving. Gioia is saying that he was following a script. Now, he's doing this in a sophisticated psychological way. He's talking about script schemas. So schema is any kind of mental representation or pattern of behavior. And the particular schema that we're dealing with here are scripts. So a script tells you what happens in a social interaction. In particular, it tells you who's involved, what authority they have in that situation, what sequence of events, whose job is it to do what, and what sequence of events does that happen. The common, easiest one, the easiest script that we all know and we all follow regularly is the script for ordering food at a fast food counter, lunch line, or getting food at a grocery store with your cashier. Maybe at the beginning there's some exchange of pleasantries. Hi, how are you doing? And then they take your order. You give them the order. They take your order. They ring it all up. There's some exchange of cash, and then you get your stuff. Right? And it goes in that sequence. There's maybe some details involved, but that's basically the regular sequence. That's our expectations for how that dynamic is supposed to go. And if it doesn't go to expectations, if you deviate from the script, then things become uncomfortable, they become weird. So if you go up to a fast food counter and you start asking the person about how their day went, what they're planning on doing later that day, who their friends are, this kind of stuff. If you start asking personal questions, or if you start telling them personal questions about yourself, if you start telling them personal questions about yourself, you start asking them personal questions at a cashier at a fast food counter, that's off script. That's not how the exchange is going to go. You might be nice and say something pleasant, but you're not supposed to investigate into details. So if you start investigating the details, something's strange, something's off script, it's weird. People start becoming uncomfortable. You might know if you've traveled to any other country that the scripts for this sort of waiter protocol, what you do in a restaurant, is different in other countries. Like when the wait staff comes over, when you're supposed to pay them, if you tip them or not tip them, how all that stuff works, it differs from place to place, country to country, culture to culture. And you have to learn how these scripts go in these different ways, in different places. Someone left a comment on, isn't there a study that showed that people will do things they normally wouldn't, like deliver shocks or something, to a person of senior authority? Yes, exactly. And in fact, that's where we're going with this. We want to eventually talk about these, the psychology of following orders, especially from people with authority. I just want to finish with this. It says the scripts are these procedures for what to follow, what to do, what's appropriate and inappropriate in a given situation. And Gioia's argument here is that he just adopted the script that Ford gave him. Right? This is when you issue recalls, and this is when you don't issue recalls. He followed that script. That was his job to follow that script, he thought. So that's why he made the decision that he did. Now, he recognizes afterwards that maybe he should have made a different decision. He says, it's fascinating to me that for several years after making this decision, I remain convinced that I had made the right decision in not recommending the recall of the cars. In a lot of the times and the evidence available, I thought I had pursued a reasonable course of action. And then he says, but more recently, I've come to think that maybe I really should have done everything I could have to get those cars off the road. So now he thinks he made the wrong decision. And part of the reason he thinks he made the wrong decision, was because the scripts being used at Ford were not the right scripts to make the decision. So Gioia doesn't want to think that he doesn't want to argue that he was personally responsible. He was just following the scripts. But maybe the scripts were bad, and maybe we need to revise our scripts for making these decisions so that we do consider our emotions and people's ethics and things other than just the money. So I want to talk more about scripts, and then I want to start talking about conformity and the pressure to conform to these social relationships. But let me just make sure that everyone's okay on Gioia, who he is, why we're reading about him, how he made his decisions. Does anyone have any thoughts about whether Gioia should be held responsible for his actions, whether he's blameworthy? Should Gioia have made a different decision? Would you have made a different decision if you were in Gioia's place? Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a thought. In the reading, there's an interesting quote that it's on page 381. It says the philosophical and ethical implications of assigning a financial value for human life or disfigurement does not seem to have been a major consideration in reaching this decision. So, I mean, that kind of explains a lot where the problem's going to start out. Kind of the main focus of the problem of this whole article.
Yeah, that's right. It was the financial decisions that were the primary issue being that weighed into the decision, and ethics and all these broader considerations, the value of a human life. None of that went into decision making. Good. Some people. Blair says he should have changed his decision. Yeah. So Blair says if he's just following orders, how is he different from a robot? Very good. Right. I mean, this is in fact this is exactly what Gioia says. He, when he's discussing these scripts, and part of the reason that we follow scripts is because it makes things easier. You don't have to think if you're following a script, right? When I go into the fast food restaurant and talk to the cashier, if I have to learn something about that individual person, tell them something so that we trust each other and you develop like a personal relationship, that would take forever. McDonald's would never work in these situations. We have these scripts so that people don't have to think and don't have to make decisions about every little thing, right? Because there's a script in place, you just follow the script, right? This is what you do in this order. And then you can have these interactions with people that you don't even know, right? So the McDonald's cashier can serve thousands of people that they've never even met, but it all goes smoothly because they're following the script. So Gioia talks about this following the script as if it's cruising on autopilot. Right? I don't have to make decisions about what to do at every point because the script tells me what to do. Right? The reason that people become uncomfortable when you go off script, right? If I start asking very personal questions to the cashier, it's uncomfortable partly because I don't know what their intentions are. I don't know what they're planning on doing. Right? Are they trying to ask me out? Or is it like a dating thing? Because the dating, the dating script, there's another script for that about how to ask someone on a date and what's appropriate and inappropriate in those situations. But that's a different script, and that has different goals than the fast food script. And so when you run off script, I have to figure out what other script you're operating on, and that's hard. Where I was thinking, and I'd rather not think. I'd rather just run on autopilot. Right, this idea that I'm just following orders is partly an idea that I'm just here to be a robot. I'm just here to do the work. I have a job. It's my job to do that job. It's not my job to think too hard about this job. Right? That's the idea. That it doesn't fall on him to make these decisions. It's his job to just follow the script. Yeah, Taylor says that sometimes scripts are necessary, but they can be inappropriate at other times. That's exactly right. And the challenge here is finding which scripts are appropriate and to make sure that those scripts are the right scripts to follow, that actually get the best outcome, the results, the ethical results, the results that we want. So scripts are definitely necessary. In fact, scripts are part of how social learning happens. They're deeply rooted in our psychology. So it's necessary to have these scripts. But the question is, when is it appropriate to break a script or go off script to go onto some other script? And then how do we do that? How do we actually engineer that so that we can break a script and go onto some other scripts? Yeah, Glenn?
The scripts weren't, I think they just act as a guideline for your job. There are certain points where you have to follow certain things in your job, but it's meant to bring in another variable of creativity, and that's what makes you either real bad at your job or really great at your job.
Yeah, that's right. So thinking about it in terms of guidelines, and then can you work within those guidelines and be flexible to situations? Maybe to relate this back to David Foster Wallace talking about the default setting, your natural default setting. The natural default setting is when I'm cruising on autopilot, when I'm not thinking too hard about what I'm doing. And in fact, I can learn really complicated scripts for doing really elaborate things on autopilot. Most of you have probably driven on autopilot in the sense where you're driving, but you're thinking about something else. Your mind is completely somewhere else. But you're driving just fine and like changing lanes and engaging with other cars and stuff. None of that's a problem because all of that procedural memory you can do without thinking about it too hard. And even more elaborate things than that can run on autopilot. And the challenge is knowing when it's okay to run on autopilot and knowing when you need to snap yourself out of it and sort of get a bigger perspective and be able to change decisions you make. In particular, this is the problem with whistleblowing. So whistleblowing is an instance where you're breaking a script. There's a corporate rule that you have to follow, but you think that rule isn't good, and so you want to blow the whistle and let other people know about it. But that's a way of breaking the script, right? You might be violating your job contract, you're violating the corporate culture. There's enormous social pressure not to do that. So knowing when to break a script and then being able to do it, right? These are big challenges. We're going to talk about whistleblowing in a lot more detail, breaking scripts next time. The goal today for this lesson is to understand how these scripts work and what effects they have on our behavior. So with this in mind, I want to show a couple of videos, I guess, just to introduce us to this basic idea. Let me go ahead and show the elevator conformity.
Candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat,
Is that working?
and subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. we'll see if we can use. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Good, good. So that was an old Candid Camera special. And so there's a script that we all follow. You face the door of the elevator, right? You go into an elevator and you turn around and you face the door. And that's the script. That's what everyone expects. But you can change the script very easily. If you put a bunch of other people who face the rear, even if you think the script goes one way, when you see the when you see the crowd going a different way, you tend to follow the crowd. And you tend to break your own script, what you think you know is right, very quickly to do what the crowd around you is doing. This is conformity. So this conformity, this is the basis of human socialization. This is how we're social creatures, is because we're really good at imitating each other and establishing these norms. So everyone going into this elevator knows that the way to stand in an elevator is to face the front, but just a few seconds of social pressure from a couple of people is enough to get that person to turn around and even sort of march in a circle. These are scripts informing behavior. Social pressure. This is the basis of social organization. This is how we're social creatures at all. This is also the basis of social learning. It's through this imitation of other scripts that we behave as we do. So the big questions that I want you to be thinking about for this little unit on psychology is how do these scripts inform our behavior, and what kind of control do we have over these scripts? Can we break these scripts? Now, when Gioia is talking about this, he says, organizational culture, in a very powerful sense, amounts to a collection of scripts writ large. What it means to have organizational culture, the culture of an organization, is just a big series of these scripts, a big collection of these scripts, all put together. And he says, well, but did I sell out? No. But were my cognitive structures saliently altered by salient experience? Without question. Scripts for understanding and action were formed and reformed in a relatively short time in a way that not only altered perceptions of issues, but also altered the likely actions associated with those altered perceptions. Right, so how you see things and what you do changes depending on what scripts you're operating by. And it's very easy for us to change our scripts to fit whatever circumstances we're in. So I want to show you one more video along these lines.
Stop. Pay attention. Take a look at this crowded waiting room. These people may appear to be waiting for the eye doctor, but they're actually waiting for the first test subject in our hidden camera experiment. And here she is, right on time for her 12 o'clock appointment.
Hi, how are you doing?
This woman thinks she's here for a free eye exam.
Have you been here before? No, it's my first time.
What she doesn't know is that everyone else in this room is working for us.
They'll be with you in just a couple minutes.
Today we're running an experiment on social conformity, and the test starts now. Did you hear that? These people sure did. It doesn't take long for our test subject to notice a pattern. Beep means stand up. But why? And if you were in her shoes, what would you do the next time the tone sounds? While you might think you make your decisions all on your own, when it comes to peer pressure, all too often, your brain is just following the crowd.
But just how far will your brain go to be part of the team?
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat, and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University.
So she just encountered this rule. She just went into this room, and this rule that she adopted because of social pressure, right? Everyone else was doing it, so she started doing it. But because she was following this rule, she internalizes the rule, so she does it even when no one's watching. And not only does she internalize it, but she passes it on to others, so that others end up following the same rule, that she doesn't even know why that rule is there, right? She doesn't understand the rule at all, but she's not only willing to follow it, but she's willing to internalize it and then pass it on to others, so that others, right? This is how culture works. All of culture is just these little rules that we happen to pick up and then pass on, and we do it over and over and over again. Emmanuel says it's astounding, it can't be true. It is true, and in fact, this kind of thing is very common. It's been studied for a long time. So one of the things I want to do first is talk about some of this background psychology research, where this is in the 50s and 60s of last century, where we really started to figure out that people's ability to reason depended a lot more on their social circumstances than we thought. In the 1950s, Ash did this conformity experiment. I don't know if I want to read all of this. There's the video on the website. Let me just show you the Ash conformity experiment. Yeah, sorry. I spelled it wrong here. Yeah, I spelled it wrong here. The Ash conformity experiments, here we go. So the Ash conformity experiments were done in the 50s, and the experiments is fairly simple. So you would be shown a line like an image like this. There's one line, and then there's three options, and your job is to say which line is the same length as the reference line. So which line A, B, and C is the same length as the reference line.
C is.
Yeah, so C, obviously C is the right one, A is too short, B is too long. This is not a difficult task. It's a very easy task to solve if you have good vision. But the experiment was not just can you solve this task, but can you solve this task in a group of people who get it wrong? Yeah, I'll go ahead and show the video. The video is pretty short.
Experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2. 2. 2. 2.
2. 3. 3.
3. 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2. 2.
2.
2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. 1. They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group.
Did you mean to mute it, Professor?
Sorry, I meant to mute the video, but I meant to talk myself. I'm just going to go ahead and keep the video muted. I'm just going to talk over it now. You can go back and watch the video on the website. Sorry about that. So the way the conformity experiment works is that the person who's giving the response is surrounded by a bunch of other people. Everyone else is a confederate of the experiment. They're all in on the experiment, giving the wrong answer. But everyone giving the wrong answer puts pressure on the one person who's in the experiment to also give the wrong answer. So in this first case, this person was like, well, they all say something different, so I must be wrong. It's where they doubt their own vision. It's a very simple task, but some people end up doubting their ability to see correctly because everyone else is giving a different answer. So they end up doubting themselves. But it might be that you don't doubt yourself. Instead of doubting yourself, you just hide your own views in order to not stick out from the crowd, right? So this person knows that everyone else is wrong, but doesn't want to make waves and get everyone to look at them like that. So this is another reason that people conform, is to not cause trouble, not make waves, and end up going along with something even though it goes against what they believe to be true. Another thing in this variation, this third person gives the correct answer. So it's 2 people give the wrong answer, and then someone gives the correct answer. Then the person gives the wrong answer, and then the person that we're experimenting on, this person in the red. And the fact that someone else gave the correct answer before them makes them a lot more likely to give the correct answer. In fact, not only do they give the correct answer, but they end up having positive feelings about the other person who gave the correct answer. They end up forming like a social bond, simply because it's them two with the right answer versus everyone else. Right, so these are conformity, right? And the idea here is it's not just the truth and it's not just what you believe. A lot of what we say and do depends on what everyone else is doing around us, so that we're shaping our action to fit other behavior, the behavior of others, in particular to go along with the crowd so we don't stand out. Now, there's sometimes that people want to stand out. There's sometimes that people want to be identified in the crowd. And so they can take actions that are not conforming actions like this. But in general, people have a tendency to conform. So Ash found that something like 35% of cases, there was some instances of conformity. And for about 75% of the people, they conformed at least once. So there was about 25% of the people, about a quarter of the people, were very stubborn, and they would put the right answer regardless of what everyone else said. But everyone, about 75% of people, the majority of people, tend to at least have one answer that conforms. They might not go with the crowd every time, but they sometimes go with the crowd. The ability of others to see you and your answers matters a lot. So in this last one, everyone's giving their answer, but the person that we're testing doesn't have to say their answer out loud, they just have to write it down. And because they're writing it down, no one else can see their response, and so they're not actually reacting to their response. And people are feel much more free to give correct responses when no one else can see. Right? This is why we do ballot like elections in curtains, so no one can see who you're voting for. Because if they can see who you're voting for, it tends to change your vote. So these are the conformity experiments, and these have been well confirmed by lots and lots of experiments since then. They were done in the 50s, and we know that these figures basically hold up, where the majority of people, 75%, conform a little bit. Everyone has this sort of disposition to conform. Again, if anyone has any questions or comments, let me know. So if we maybe I'll stop here and ask a question before we go on to the Milgram experiment. But if we know that human psychology is disposed very strongly to follow the crowd, to conform to the behavior of the crowd, does that mean that we shouldn't hold people responsible for their actions? How does that affect our responsibility if people are so disposed to follow what the crowd does? Should we hold Gioia accountable, given that there's this overwhelming psychological disposition to go along with cases that, even that you know to be wrong, for the fact of social conformity? And this is the same question. I guess it's the same question that I've been raising, but I just wanted to hit it one more time. Yeah, Taylor says, I guess that's why the Nuremberg Defense is allowed to diminish the sentence but not remove it. Yeah. It's because of the psychological tendency. Maybe one thing to emphasize here is that this happens even if you're aware of the tendency, and even if you think the tendency is not happening. I've talked to lots of people in these classes who say that last week we were talking about the cigarette smoking, and in the classes, in the live lectures, lots of people saying, "Oh, that advertising doesn't work on me." I know they spend a lot of money on advertisements, but I don't. That doesn't change how I think, how I behave. A lot of people tend to think. Part of the psychological disposition is that we think that we're in control of our behavior. In fact, this is just a psychological illusion. It's often the case that we're just not aware of the sources of our behavior, and we're not aware of the influences that are bringing us to act in certain ways. So we'll say that the advertising doesn't affect us. In fact, it affects us very strongly, but we just think we're immune. We think we're acting by ourselves. And same thing in general in a social situation like this. You might think you have a lot more freedom than you actually have. I don't have the Milgram experiments up here. Okay, so I'm out of the range of my Prezi, but let me say a couple of things before going on. Another thing I don't have on the Prezi is the stuff from Chapter 6 of the textbook, page 146 to 172. Chapter 6 of the textbook is about workplace responsibilities, and a lot of what it talks about is how to develop the proper corporate culture that encourages people to act ethically and make ethical decisions. Because if acting unethically is part of the script, then you can also build scripts to get people to act ethically, right? So Chapter 6 in your textbook has a lot to do with how to build an ethical corporate environment, how to structure your language so that it's encourages people to make ethical decisions, how to set the tone, how the behavior of management influences the behavior of the other workers, the other staff. Chapter 6 also talks a lot about loyalty and the importance of loyalty in managing a corporate environment, a professional workplace environment. So I just wanted to flag that. There's some stuff of interest here, especially if you're thinking about the problem of management and the conflicts between management and the rest of staff. Chapter 6 is a good resource for that. I'm interested in the psychology though, so I want to talk about another experiment. So Ash in the 50s did these conformity experiments, but the conformity experiments are all peer-based experiments. They're peer pressure. The people in that waiting room, no one has authority over anyone else. Those are all just people in that room. And so any conformity is just the conformity of equal peers. But the challenge is not just conforming to a social situation of peers. The challenge really is conforming to a social situation where there are superiors with people with authority over you, maybe the capacity to punish you or praise you or reward you, give you a raise, fire you, that kind of stuff. So the issue of how to deal with people with authority, this isn't the conformity experiments, these are the obedience experiments, specifically when will you obey. Milgram was a student of Ash's. And Milgram was also inspired by, not the My Lai Massacre, this is in the 60s, he was inspired by World War II, and in particular the trial of Eichmann. Yeah, so let's talk about Eichmann before we go on. Here's Eichmann. Eichmann was an SS officer in the Nazi government in Germany during World War II. Eichmann, he was a middleman. He wasn't the head boss. He was a bureaucrat. He had an office job, but his job primarily consisted in organizing the Holocaust, the extermination program. So he was involved with a lot of the logistics, the design, the development of the facilities, all the logistical stuff for organizing the extermination process, transporting a bunch of Jews to these extermination camps where they would house them and eventually kill them. Millions of human beings died this way in these extermination camps. Somewhere between 5 and 6 million Jews in these extermination camps. It's a huge number of people, and in fact, it's sort of grossly out of proportion with what we would expect from war generally. World War II, it's worth stopping and saying this right now. World War II was an incredibly tragic event, not just from the Holocaust and all these people dying, but just the war itself killed millions of people besides. It was an incredible tragedy, a global tragedy, millions and millions of people dying. But the real horror, I mean, human beings have been at war forever. The real tragedy, the real horrifying thing about World War II was how technologically sophisticated it was, right? This wasn't just people who were angry and beating each other with sticks. This was a industrialized program of extermination, right? Where the Jews were tagged and numbered, and all the books were kept, and it was done in very much like any other industrial process, any other highly engineered industrial process anywhere else in the world. So part of the horror here was not just that we were doing this terrible thing, but we were doing it with this incredible technological efficiency that had only come from the modern era. So World War II is this horrifyingly modern war. And part of what's so scary about it is how inhumane we treat each other, where we can round up by big groups of people to exterminate them in a systematic, industrialized way. I keep saying industrialized because the industries helped, right? IBM, the computer company, helped the Germans do all the bookkeeping for the Holocaust, right? They were involved in that process. Lots of German companies at the time that are still around today were involved in the engineering and the development of the Holocaust. And Eichmann was a bureaucrat. He wasn't the one deciding to do the program, but once the program was decided on, he was the one who had to actually engineer and get it going. Right? It was his job to work with the nuts and bolts to get it to actually come off. And he did, and he ended up killing a bunch of people. Much after the war, Eichmann makes it through the war alive, and then Taylor says everyone stole at his old job, and you'd be really ridiculed for not stealing, so it made you feel bad about not stealing. Yeah, it's good social pressure to steal. Yeah. So Eichmann was this boss. Was a bureaucrat during World War II. After World War II, he survives World War II, and long after World War II in the 60s, he's in prison and gets taken to Israel. And in the 60s, Israel decides to put Eichmann on trial in a very public show trial for the papers. Everyone's paying attention. Israel has just been founded recently, and this is partly for their identity and sort of coming to grips with what had happened, everything with the Holocaust. And part of what they do is they put Eichmann on trial in 1961. So it's a big thing. And in the course of the trial, Eichmann gives the Nuremberg Defense. He says that he was listening to his orders. So Eichmann insisted that he didn't have any authority in the Nazi hierarchy and he was only following orders. He says there's a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and people like me forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of the leaders. He says I was not a responsible leader, nor do I feel myself as such. And so Eichmann says he was just following orders. Moreover, he says that he believes that he has an ethical obligation to follow orders, that part of what ethics amounts to is doing what you're told, right? And he has a job to do, and this is what his boss told him to do. And so he thought that he was doing the right thing, right? That this is what ethics demanded of him. To do the right thing is to follow the orders that you were given. So he makes this argument, and it's in Israel. It's an Israeli court. They're obviously not going to be sympathetic, and they find him guilty. And he's eventually hung for war crimes after a long series of appeals. When Eichmann goes on trial, he's sent to. Eichmann goes on trial, and the New Yorker sends Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher who's also Jewish, a German Jewish philosopher. Let me show you a picture of her. Hannah Arendt. Yeah, there she is. She was younger when the trial was on. She was a little bit younger. Hannah Arendt was a Jew in Germany. She ended up escaping before things went bad, and eventually came to the US, where she taught at Columbia for the rest of her life. So she was in New York and Columbia, teaching in the philosophy department there for most of the 20th century, major figure in 20th century philosophy. But during this trial, the New Yorker sent Hannah Arendt to the trial to report on it. And one of the things that Arendt says that I want to flag here at the beginning is she talks about the banality of evil. Yeah, so the subtitle of the report is a report on the banality of evil. Banality, banal, banal. So lacking in originality as to be obvious or boring. Something is banal when it's trite, hackneyed, cliched, overdone, stale, worn out, dull, uninteresting, trivial. So Hannah Arendt's talking about the banality of evil. You might think this is strange. Aren't evil things supposed to be like really frightening and she's calling it boring. Evil is boring. And what she means is someone like Eichmann. We have this picture in our head of evil as being some really scary thing. The evil. Imagine the evil Dr. Claw in his office, like stroking his cat and making a bunch of evil plans with his fingers steepled and lightning bolts in the background and stuff. Right. This is normally how we think of evil. We think of evil as great, sort of great evil. And Hannah Arendt's point is that evil, in fact, is usually not great like that. It's usually not a bunch of deliberately malicious people planning to do a bunch of evil stuff. Instead, evil looks a lot more like Eichmann, people who are normal people. Arendt says that Eichmann was boring. He says, despite all efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster, but it was indeed difficult not to suspect that he was a clown. Called him clown-like. Right? The idea is that he's sort of a bumbling bureaucrat, semi-competent, and he's really just doing what he's told. If you've ever watched like Parks and Recreations or The Office or whatever, you know that there's a bunch of people who are just incompetent, end up doing some good things and some bad things, but really incompetent the whole way. This is how Arendt is talking about Eichmann. Eichmann is a clown. Eichmann is not a mastermind evil doer. Eichmann is just a regular person. And this is what's scary for Arendt about Eichmann, is that any one of us could have been Eichmann, right? Banality in the sense is that Eichmann's actions were ordinary, but that there's potential for Eichmann in all of us. Not that Eichmann's actions were ordinary, but that Eichmann himself was ordinary, that any of us could have been Eichmann, and that any of us in the same position might have done the same thing. Right? If Eichmann was just doing his job, just following orders, well, there's lots of other people in jobs they don't really care about who just do what they're told. And this is what Hannah Arendt says, that evil in this world is at least partly a product of this kind of thing, of normal people not paying attention to what they're doing, causing great evils in the world. Eichmann undoubtedly caused a huge amount of evil in the world. His actions ended up with lots and lots of people dying. And what's scary about that is that there's nothing special about Eichmann, that he could have been any one of us. And that any one of us in the same situation might have done the same thing. It's very difficult to believe that any of us could have killed millions of people, or could have, done work to kill millions of people. And Hannah Arendt says that Eichmann is an example of this. Well, okay, so this is going on in early 60s, and Milgram, a psychologist, wants to test this theory, this banality of evil theory. Is Hannah Arendt actually right? Could any of us actually be Eichmann? Right? Milgram asks, could it be that Eichmann and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Could this be any of us? So he devises this experiment, the Milgram experiment, this is the shock experiment, to see how far we're willing to go to follow orders. It's a classic experiment with three people in the experiment, the experimenter, the teacher, and the learner. And the experimenter and the learner are both confederates of the experiment. Yeah, Blair says anyone can kill. It might be true that anyone can kill, but can people kill without even realizing that they're killing? Can people kill while thinking they're doing good? Right? That's the thing about Eichmann, is that he thought he was doing the right thing. And he might even admit that killing people in general is wrong, but he thought, because he was so immersed in this culture, he thought he was doing the right thing. Right? So this is, people might be brought to kill knowing that it's wrong and still do it anyway for whatever terrible reasons. But the scary part is people being brought to kill and thinking that they're doing the right thing, thinking that what they're doing is for the best. This is the engineering case, right? We just saw Gioia. Dennis Gioia could have recalled this car and saved people's lives. He didn't do that, though, because he was following the script. But not only did he not save these people's lives, He thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he made the best decision by not saving these people's lives. And that's the scary thing, people thinking that they're doing the best when they're acting unethically. Eichmann thought he was doing the right thing while he was killing millions of people. Okay, so the Milgram experiment, there's the experimenter, the teacher, and the learner. And the trick here is that the experimenter and the learner are both confederates of the experiment. They're both in on the experiment. They're part of the experiment. The subject is the teacher. And the teacher is told, what the teacher is told is that this is a memory experiment. And they were trying to test the memory of the learner to see how well they can memorize a list of words. So there's a list of words. It's the teacher's job to make sure that the learner memorizes this list of words. And the way they're going to do it is by shocking the learner if they get anything wrong. So there's a shock. See how well shocking gets people to learn. So the teacher will lead a list of words, will read a list of words. The learner will say the next word in the list. And the teacher's job is to determine whether there's a correct answer. If it's correct, then you go on to the next word. If it was incorrect, then you give the learner a shock. Let's look at the video. Yeah, so it's muted. So here's the shock device. So it's these little switches. You pull the switch and it shocks. You see intensity shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock as we get up to 350 volts. Goes up to 400 volts. It starts at 110 volts. Goes up to 450 volts. The secret word. The secret word is script. Script. Go ahead and stop right there. SCRIPT. If you put the word script into the online sign-in, there's six active people right now. Let's see how many leave as soon as they put in the secret word. I'll put the secret word on the Prezi also when I complete it, but you can get the attendance credit by using the word script. Okay, so yeah, so there's these extreme shocks, and the teacher is going to have to go up these shocks to more and more advanced shocks every time the learner gets something wrong. By the way, at the beginning of this, they had the teacher and the learner draw straws to see who's the teacher and who's the learner. It's fixed so that the teacher is always the person being experimented on. The learner is always Confederate, but they think that it was random. They think that they could have just as easily been the learner. And then when the learner gets set up in the shock machine, remember the learner is not really going to get shocked. This is just all for show. But as they're setting him up in the shock machine, the learner tells the doctor that they just seen a heart doctor because they've been having some trouble with their heart. And the doctor says they have a heart condition, and that means they shouldn't be involved in any strenuous exercise or anything that might set off their heart condition. So the learner asks, are these shocks dangerous? Will it affect my heart condition? And the experimenter says, no, it's fine. You should be fine. The shocks aren't that painful. They even give the teacher an example shock so that they know how painful they are. And then they start running through with the experiment. Yeah, so there's the shocks. And then they run through the experiment. The experimenter sits standing right behind. The experimenter is sitting right behind the teacher. The teacher is looking at the panel and administering these shocks. The learner is in the other room, and you can hear the learner in the other room. So as the shocks get more severe, the learner starts screaming, it hurts. I can't stand the pain. Help me, get me out of here. I want to stop the experiment. Let me out of here. But the experimenter keeps telling the teacher to keep going through with the tests, keep administering the shocks. And the experiment is to see how long the teacher will keep administering the shocks. Right? This is the obedience experiment. Will you keep listening to the experimenter telling you to keep giving these shocks? Let's go ahead and watch some of this. So there's a couple of different people. This is the classic Milgram experiment. There's a couple of different people here that we can look at, but let me show you this guy at the end. This guy, yeah.
That on the board. Yet actually, 50% of the subjects obey the experimenter's commands fully in the experiment depicted in this film.
Wrong. 90 volts. Wrong. Volts. 135. Answer woman. N, white cloud. Horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. Next word is sad.
You want me to keep going?
Continue, please.
Oh, sad. Sad. Face, music, clown, girl. Correct. Next one, short. Sentence, movie, skirt, time. Answer, please. Wrong. 165 volts. Time.
Let me out.
That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know, they have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man there. You hear him hollering?
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not
but he's in
dangerous.
there hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. You know, I'm not. I mean, he's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and I mean, geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please.
I really like that exchange. So, this guy breaks my heart every time I watch him. He doesn't like doing this. He fights it. He fights with the experimenter. He tells him, "Look, that guy's in pain. We got to stop this." He's struggling. He's got his head in his hands. He's sort of like, he's very nervous. He's very agitated. He doesn't want to hurt this guy. It's not in his interest of hurting him. At the beginning, he even laughs a little bit, sort of laughs nervously, right? Because he knows he's doing something wrong. But despite the fact that he knows he's doing something wrong, the fact that he's very uncomfortable with it, he continues to go through when the experimenter says to continue, right? He says, well, who's going to take responsibility? The experimenter says, well, I'll take responsibility. And the guy's like, well, okay, if you're going to take responsibility, I'm going to keep going. This guy will eventually go through all the way to 450 volts. Somewhere around 350 volts, they cut off. So all of the responses that you hear from the learner in the other room are pre-recorded, same every time. And after about 300 volts, they just shut off the recording, so you don't hear anything from the learner anymore. As far as you know, they might be dead. But the experimenter says you got to keep going, all the way up to 450 volts. This guy goes up to 450 volts. Long after the person stops responding, he goes through the entire sequence, all the way up to 450 volts. And in fact, that's the results of the Milgram experiment. It seems to confirm that, in fact, we are willing to conform to obedience quite regularly. 65% of experiments in the original run of this experiment, 65% of participants administers the experiment's final massive 450 volt shock. 65%, 26 out of 40, went all the way through to the very last shock, very strongest shock. Followed the orders the whole way. We don't like to run this experiment. Psychologists don't run this experiment very much anymore because it's very traumatic to the subjects. I need to plug in. Subjects, they sweat, they stutter, they groan, they laugh nervously, they jitter. They don't like doing it, but even despite this physical discomfort, they follow along. They originally predicted that only something like 5%, maybe 4% of subjects would continue to the end. They thought going into the experiment that very few of the people would actually follow this, right? Because you can hear the person screaming in the other room, that people would stop. But in fact, majority, 65%. And this has been confirmed on several versions of this test. The majority of people continue to go on. This guy makes me cry. At the very end of the experiment, where they're explaining things to him, and then they bring out the other. I mean, yeah. So he even gets up out of his chair. He gets up out of his chair and is just very not comfortable. And eventually, the other guy comes out, and they reconcile. The guy comes out and he shakes his hand and he feels a lot better. You can see the smile on his face. But when they ask him, why did you keep going through with the shocks? He says, well, because the guy kept telling me to do it. I didn't want to, but he kept telling me to do it. So, what am I going to do? That's how the experiment works. Okay. I've already gone for about an hour and a half. Let me finish up just by saying a couple of things. Not everyone goes through with it all the way. So 65% goes through with the final electric shock, but a significant percentage also stop and refuse to go along any further. And the way the experiment works is that there was a script that the experiment had to follow. So if the teacher yields, it says they don't want to go through, the experiment is supposed to go, please continue, and then if they keep resisting, you say, the experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, that you have no other choice, you must go on. Right? These are the prods to get the experiment to keep going through with the experiment. And the rule was that if anyone continued to refuse after this fourth prompt, then they would just stop the experiment. And no one got there. I mean, people got there, but very few people got there. The 65% never got to this point. They would just follow the orders after being pressed a couple of times. But the interesting thing is that once you got to this point, once you told someone that they had no choice, that was exactly when they insisted they had a choice. So everyone that they said that they got to this fourth case, that you must go on, you have no choice, every one of those people insisted that in fact they do have a choice and they refuse to go on any further. So telling people that they have no choice is the fastest way to make them exercise their free choice. Telling them that they have no choice and they will make a choice. But it doesn't even take much prodding to get people to go through with an experiment that might have killed someone. I'll say that it's really important. The authority is really important in this experiment. The fact that the experimenter is a scientist tied to a major research institution like Yale University, in a lab coat, looks very professional at the university in a professional environment. The fact that all of this stuff looks legit makes people trust the experimenter. If any of that seems weird, if the experimenter is dressed casually in board shorts, doesn't look well kept, isn't attached to a major research institution, then people will stop following their orders. The authority has to look like a legitimate authority for people to follow their orders. If there's multiple authorities and they disagree, if there's two experimenters and one of the experimenters like, you got to keep going, and the other experimenter's like, well, maybe we should stop, then the teacher will stop. The teacher, if there looks like any disagreement among the authorities, then no one will follow along. Then the teachers will stop following along. There's a lot more to say about this stuff. I strongly recommend you look up the Milgram Experiment and look at the video. Watch some of these guys. This guy's really neat. The guy before him is also pretty good, this guy. And then this guy in the white shirt is amazing. Watch these people. Think about the decisions that they're making, why they're making these decisions, and how you would make a decision in a similar case. Think about following orders, when it's okay to follow orders, how to break orders. I want to close by watching the first follower video. Let me see if anyone, does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and throw on the first follower video, and then we'll end it there.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Yay! Yeah. So this capacity to follow is it's why we're as intelligent as we are. It's why we're as successful as a species as we are. It's difficult to overstate how important this is to our success as a species, to our intelligence as a cognitive creature. So a lot of these examples are about the dangers of following, the dangers of conformity, and how it can get things wrong. But I just wanted to close by just remembering this following is important. It's necessary for what we do. And so the issue isn't just how do you stop following people. You need to follow people. That's how life works. That's how society organizes. But making decisions about when to follow people, who to follow, when to stop following. Right, these are the hard decisions to make. Okay, that's basically all I wanted to say. There's lots of other stuff to talk about on the website, but I've been talking for a long time. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Unless there's any last questions. Remember the word of the day, the secret word is script. So you can go ahead and sign in on the sign sheet for that. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. I'll see you all next week.